Zechariah chapter 4. Zechariah is the second last chapter in the Old Testament. Zechariah chapter 4, and reading from verse 8. Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house. His hands shall also finish it. And thou shalt know that the Lord of hosts hath sent me unto you. For who hath despised the day of small things? For they shall rejoice, and shall see the plummet in the hand of Zerubbabel with those seven. They are the eyes of the Lord, which run to and fro through the whole earth. Amen. That the Lord would bless his word to us. To his name be all the praise and glory. Well, just for a few moments, we can focus our attention on that. The first part of verse 10, where we read, For who hath despised the day of small things? Zechariah, as many of you know, was one of the restoration prophets. That is, he prophesied to the people of God after they returned from the exile in Babylon. And Zechariah began to prophesy around the same time as Haggai in around 520 BC. So that's 16 years after the children of Israel had begun to return. They returned to Jerusalem in 536 or so, and Ezra tells us, he chronicles the history of that time, and he tells us that immediately they began to rebuild the temple. They put things in order, they ordered materials, they laid the foundation and so on, but shortly after that they stopped. And there were a number of reasons for that: political reasons, economic reasons, spiritual reasons. But amongst these reasons, there was this, that they despised the day of small things. And that was one of the reasons that they stopped building the temple. And it was one of the things that discouraged them when in Zechariah and Haggai's day, they began to rebuild the temple again. They were despising the day of small things. Now, what does that mean? Well, Ezra tells us that in 6, people praised God with a loud voice and they sang to him. But the older people, many of them, the ancient, experienced, the priests, the elders, the former temple had seen it, or certainly they had heard of it, and were told that the people concerned the noise of from the noise of the weak. Very shortly after this, and there were many reasons for it, but shortly after work ceased. This was one of the reasons for it. This group directly when the rebuilding started. The same, he's addressing the issue of 16 years previous, but he's addressing an issue which was still, and he says to them, who's left among you that saw this house in her first glory? And how do you see it now? Is it not in your eyes in comparison of it as nothing? So he's asking the question, and Zechariah is asking a question as well. Who's despised the day of all things? But again, it's an accusation as well. What's the problem? Well, for these people, the foundation itself wasn't the problem. The size of the temple wasn't the problem. It was around the same size as Solomon's temple. But the problem was that they realized that the new temple wasn't going to be like the old temple. It wasn't. And, you know, they were being realistic in that. They understood that they couldn't redo what had been undone. They realized that their new temple wouldn't be as grand, it wouldn't be as ornate, that it wouldn't be. They didn't have the resources, they didn't have the money, neither did they have the manpower. We're told that just over 42,000 Jews returned to Jerusalem. Now, in David's day, there were over 500,000 people in Judah alone. And so the cause was weak. It was weaker than it was. Their number was smaller than it was. They had no political clout, no economic clout. They were truly living in a day of small things. And that's just how it was. And Zechariah doesn't question that. He doesn't say, well, who of you is saying that this is a day of small things? He doesn't say that. He says, who's despised the day? The problem wasn't that they understood that it was a day of small things. It was what they did with that knowledge. It had to do with whether the day in their minds led to optimism or whether it led to pessimism. And for them, it led to pessimism. From their perspective that there's no way of returning to the glory days. No way of Israel becoming great again, and no way even of God fulfilling his covenant of making this people a blessing to all the families of the earth. And so what their realism led them to was really nostalgia. And nostalgia led to discouragement. They resigned themselves to defeat. Nostalgia is to wistfully look back and to long for what has been and for what has gone. And so you find that instead of praising God for what he was doing, they wept. And instead of working, they ceased to work because they realized that the day that they were living in wasn't the day that they used to live in. This older generation, and it was the older people, we have to take note of that, who'd seen greater things, or, well, who'd certainly heard of greater things, perhaps knew their history better, they spread their discouragement to the young as well. And as discouragement spread throughout the camp, eventually the work ground to a halt. Now, we need to apply this. We live in a day of small things. We don't have to go, well, we have to go back a long time, actually, to see the state of religion in our own country or in the countries that many of you represent, certainly if you're in the Western world, as low as it is today. I can only speak for the Reformed Church as I know it, but we know, many of us have been saying, we've been realizing that much of the life has gone, much of the power has gone, much of the enthusiasm has gone, much of the power in prayer, the power in preaching, much of the devotion has gone, much of the hope has gone. Numbers in our church services pre-COVID and during COVID are in many cases pitiful. We're weakened by division as a church. Worldliness abounds amongst the membership. The gold has become dim. We're surrounded by discouragement almost on every side. And we're not despising the day of small things by admitting these things. Admitting these things is part of our confronting the day of small things. We always need to be realistic in every aspect of our Christianity. And our churches have seen better days. Our nation have seen better days. Some of you yourselves can maybe say spiritually you've seen days. But you look on older days, days when you were perhaps more lively in the faith, when people were being converted, when people were growing in their faith, and you can sit in your armchair and think about these things and almost feed off them. And it's good to do that. God's calling us to remember. And there's a whole biblical of history and what we do with the past. And those who refuse to remember will, of course, repeat many of the mistakes of the past, both in doctrine and in practice. And to forget our past is in biblical terms, it's a sin. And it's a sin which leads to greater sin. But living in the day that we live in, a day of small things as it is, that can lead to nostalgia. And that's a dangerous thing in the Christian life. To long for the past, to live in the past, to yearn for it. There's this helplessness about it because you know that things are never going to be as they were. And you feel that God will never work as he did, that the barriers are too great, the mountains are too high, the problems are too many, the church is too weak. And so you retreat into the past, into your memories. You become insular, your perspective narrows, your hope, you become more critical of the present. Your prayers become, if you're being honest, witness style, and your whole space more empty. And it's because, honest, you're taking your eye off the Lord, of who he is and what he can do. And you become so realistic in your own mind that you become, spiritually speaking or biblically speaking, unrealistic because you're letting go of your theology. You're remembering so much that you're forgetting who God is, forgetting what God can do, what he's done in the past, what he can do in the present. That's what it means to despise the day of small things. It's to believe almost that the day is too small for God to work in it. You wouldn't subscribe to that in theory, but in practice, that's really what you're living out. And when you think like that, you discourage yourself. You weaken your own hands in God's work. You also discourage others. You weaken the hands of those around you. You're not confirming the feeble knees. And so it was in Zechariah's day. The work ceased, not just among the older people, but the young, because they were discouraged. We've all perhaps been in fellowships when we've been speaking about the olden days, and these can be very profitable and they're very good. I remember being in one once, and somebody asked the older generation who'd been speaking all night, how can we re-find this? How can we regain it? And the older generation had no answer. They didn't that night anyway, and sort of muttering away that they were too old. That was discouraging, and that was nostalgia. What's the answer then? The great discouragement of our day. Well, we read of David in his own day of small things, that he encouraged himself in the Lord. And you know, friends, that's what we've got to do. We've got to encourage ourselves, encourage each other. Truth. We've got to be reminding ourselves of who God is, but also what the church is. That we are the body of Christ. That we're God's covenant people. We're his treasured possession. We are the temple of the Lord in New Testament terms. He dwells in his people. They are, in a very real way, his glory. And friends, we have to remember too that God delights to work in a day of small things, because his name is in many ways more glorified in the sight of men when he does so. Haggai told the people at this time, he said that the glory of this latter house, despicable as it was in their own eyes, it would be greater than the former. God would work from this small seed. And it was Christ's own day, not a day of small things. The Apostles' Day, it began as a day of small things. The Reformers' Day, Whitfield's Day, the Disruption Fathers, their own day began as a day of small things. I can think of the revival which began in our own island in the 1820s under Alexander MacLeod and Uig, a day of small things, if ever there was one. But these people, they worked and they were expectant. They were expectant. That's what goes when we despise the day of small things. They prayed and they preached and they listened with anticipation. They believed that God was going to work. It's amazing reading the biographies or journals of Whitfield. And that was a day of small things. And the clergy were against them. The churches were closed to them. The people were largely ignorant. But as they prayed, they believed that they were on the cusp of something great. And they were. They knew that it's not by might, by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord of hosts, as this chapter so reminds us. So friends, let me conclude. Don't retreat into history in an unhealthy way. Rather, learn from it and realize that this is a day of small things. It is. Don't despise it. Don't be pessimistic over it. Rather, encourage yourselves in the truth and encourage one another to pray meaningfully, expectantly. History, who's also the God of the present, to the God of the dead, who is also the God of the living, to the God who promises that he will build his church so that the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Amen.